Your father is being detained by the police, and the HOA president says he refuses to cooperate. That was the sentence that made me stop everything. I was several states away when my phone rang, and for a few seconds I could not understand what I was hearing. My father, Robert Parker, was 71 years old. He was not the kind of man who caused trouble, and he certainly was not the kind of man who ignored authority. But someone had decided that he was a problem. I asked the caller where my father was. The answer made my stomach tighten. He was standing outside the community clubhouse with the HOA president and 2 police officers. I immediately called my father. He answered on the second ring. "Ethan, do not worry," he said. His voice was calm, but I could tell something was wrong. I asked him what happened. He hesitated. "She wanted me to sign something." "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew. "The HOA president." My father explained that Victoria Bennett had approached him that morning while he was checking the mail. She claimed there was a violation connected to my property, and said he needed to acknowledge it on my behalf. My father told her he was not the property owner. He was only staying at the house while I was away. Victoria apparently did not like that answer. She insisted that he sign a document confirming that the property was subject to HOA enforcement. My father refused because he did not understand what he was being asked to acknowledge. That was when the situation escalated. Victoria called the police and described him as someone refusing to cooperate with the association. My father told me he had not signed anything. I believed him immediately. "Dad, stay where you are. I am coming home." He started to object. He did not want me to interrupt my work. I told him this was not about work anymore. It was about making sure he was treated fairly. I contacted Daniel Brooks, the federal supervisor coordinating my return. I explained the situation without exaggerating it. I was not asking him to interfere with a private HOA dispute. I simply needed to get home safely and quickly because my father was involved in a situation I did not understand. Daniel told me arrangements could be made for my return. Several hours later, I was on my way back. As we approached my neighborhood, I could see the community clubhouse in the distance. Police vehicles were parked outside. My father was still there. Victoria was standing beside him with a folder in her hands. She looked completely confident. Then the convoy entered the neighborhood. She turned toward the vehicles, clearly unsure why they were there. I stepped out and walked directly toward my father. I did not look at Victoria. I did not ask what she thought she was doing. I simply asked my father, "Are you okay?" He nodded. Then I asked the question that changed the entire situation. "Dad, what exactly did she want you to sign?" He looked at the folder in Victoria's hands. "I do not know," he said. "But I know I was right not to sign it." Daniel walked over and asked to see the document. Victoria hesitated before handing it over. Daniel read the first page, then the second. His expression changed. He looked at me and said, "Ethan, this is not just an acknowledgment of an HOA notice." I took the document from him. At the bottom of the first page was a sentence that made me stop. My father had never been the owner of the property. So why had Victoria prepared a document for him to acknowledge the HOA's authority? And why had she chosen to do it while I was away? The sentence at the bottom of that page was not something my father should have been asked to acknowledge. Daniel read it again, then looked at me. "This document appears to be written for the property owner." I nodded. "And my father is not the owner." "Exactly." Victoria stepped closer. "It is a standard HOA acknowledgment. There is nothing unusual about it." Daniel remained calm. "Then why was it presented to a person who is not listed as the owner?" Victoria did not answer immediately. Instead, she said that my father had been acting as the person responsible for the property while I was away. My father shook his head. "I was checking the house and getting the mail. That is all." I believed him. He had helped me with the property many times, but he had never represented himself as the owner. Daniel turned the first page over. "There is another issue," He pointed to a section requiring the signer to acknowledge that the property was subject to specific HOA enforcement provisions. If my father had signed it, Victoria could have argued that someone connected to the property had formally acknowledged those terms. My father had done exactly the right thing by refusing to sign something he did not understand. I asked Victoria a simple question. "When did you prepare this?" She answered, "This morning." I looked at the date printed near the bottom. It was not this morning. It had been prepared the previous afternoon. That detail changed my understanding of the situation. Victoria had not simply reacted to my father's refusal. She had prepared the document before she even spoke with him. Daniel noticed it too. "Why would you prepare this before meeting him?" Victoria said she expected the issue to be resolved quickly. I asked what issue she was expecting to resolve. She said the property had several outstanding compliance concerns. I asked her to show me those concerns. She opened her folder and produced 3 notices. The first concerned landscaping. The second concerned a vehicle parked near the driveway. The third concerned an administrative fee. None of them explained why my father needed to sign an acknowledgment of ownership-related obligations. Daniel compared the notices with the document. "These notices are addressed to the property owner," he said. "The acknowledgment is written as though the signer has authority to accept these terms on behalf of the owner." Victoria folded her arms. "He was there. I needed someone to acknowledge them." My father looked at me. I could see that he was embarrassed by the entire situation, even though he had done nothing wrong. I put a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing." Then I turned back to Victoria. "Where is the actual owner notice?" She pointed toward the folder. "It was sent to you." I looked at Daniel. He nodded. That meant Victoria knew exactly who owned the property. She had known my name. She had known I was away. Yet she had chosen to approach my 71-year-old father instead. I asked why. Victoria said she simply wanted the matter handled quickly. Daniel opened his laptop and checked the timeline. "There is an HOA board meeting tomorrow morning," he said. That explained the urgency. Victoria had a deadline of her own. She wanted the compliance issue documented before the meeting. But I still did not know why my father's signature mattered so much. Then Daniel found the first real clue. He had searched the HOA records for the property, and discovered that the association had recently changed how it documented owner acknowledgments. The change had been approved just days earlier. I looked at Victoria. "Who requested that change?" She hesitated for the first time. Daniel scrolled through the meeting records. "We are about to find out. The person who requested the change was Victoria Bennett." Daniel's words landed harder than I expected. My father looked at me, then at the HOA president. Victoria did not deny it. She simply said the change was necessary because too many property owners were avoiding responsibility by having other people communicate with the association. I asked her whether that meant she had intentionally created a new acknowledgement process. She said the board had approved it. Daniel opened the meeting minutes and read the entry aloud. The policy had been approved 4 days earlier. It required anyone acting on behalf of a property owner to acknowledge certain HOA notices in writing. I asked why my father had been presented with a document that went beyond acknowledging a notice. Victoria said the document was based on the new policy. Daniel disagreed. He pointed to a paragraph that referred specifically to accepting the association's authority over the property. That language was not in the policy approved by the board. For the first time, Victoria looked genuinely uncomfortable. My father quietly said, "That is the part one did not want to sign." I looked at him. "You made the right choice." He nodded, but I could tell he still felt responsible for the situation. I told him none of this was his fault. Then Daniel asked Victoria for the original template used to create the document. She said she would need to check with the board. Daniel replied that the meeting was less than 24 hours away, so waiting would not make the question disappear. Victoria finally opened another file. Inside was a draft document with several sections highlighted. One section concerned owner acknowledgments. Another concerned enforcement actions. The third concerned situations where the legal owner was unavailable. Daniel, read the third section carefully. This is not the same language as the policy you approved. Victoria said the document had been adapted for the circumstances. I asked who had authorized the adaptation. She did not answer. Daniel checked the file properties on the document. It had been created the previous afternoon at 3:17 in the afternoon. I remembered where I had been at that exact time. I had been in another state, working on an official assignment. Victoria knew I was away. That made the timing impossible to ignore. I asked her one final question. Did you know my father was not the owner before you approached him? She hesitated. Then she said, I knew you were the owner. That was enough. My father looked down at the floor. I could tell he was trying to understand why he had been placed in the middle of something he had never agreed to. Daniel closed the file and told me there was one more problem. The HOA had a special board meeting scheduled for the next morning, and the new acknowledgment policy was on the agenda for formal review. If Victoria had succeeded in getting my father to sign, she could have presented that signature as evidence that the new process worked. But my father had refused. Now the board would have to explain why a document containing language beyond the approved policy had been prepared in the first place. Victoria gathered her papers and said the meeting would settle everything. I watched her walk away with the same confidence she had shown earlier. But now I knew something she did not realize I knew. She had not simply made a mistake with my father. She had created a paper trail. Daniel looked at the clock. We have until tomorrow morning to find out how far that paper trail goes. I nodded. Then that is what we are going to do. Daniel found the first clue at 9:12 that night, and it was enough to change what I thought Victoria had been trying to do. He opened the HOA meeting records on his laptop and showed me the policy approved 4 days earlier. The new policy required anyone acting on behalf of a property owner to acknowledge certain notices in writing. On paper, it sounded ordinary. But Daniel compared that policy with the document Victoria had given my father. The language was different. The HOA policy required acknowledgment of a notice. Victoria's document required the signer to acknowledge the association's authority over the property. That was not the same thing. I asked Daniel to print both versions. He did. Then he opened the original board meeting minutes. Victoria had proposed the policy herself. My father sat quietly across from us, still trying to understand why a simple HOA complaint had turned into something so complicated. I told him he did not need to worry about any of it. He had refused to sign a document he did not understand, and that was enough. Daniel then checked the document history. The version presented to my father had been created at 3:17 in the afternoon the previous day. My travel records showed I had already been out of state for nearly 12 hours. Victoria had known I was away. That detail bothered me more than the document itself. I asked Daniel to check whether anyone else had received the same form. He searched the HOA records and found 3 recent cases involving properties whose owners were temporarily unavailable. In 2 cases, the owners had signed the acknowledgment electronically. In the third case, the property manager had signed. My father's situation was different. Victoria had personally approached him. Daniel pulled the related files and found another detail. Every one of those cases involved properties with outstanding HOA compliance disputes. The new acknowledgment process had become a way to create written confirmation from someone connected to the property. I asked whether that was allowed. Daniel said the answer depended on the governing documents and the exact authority given to representatives. But your father was not acting as your legal representative, he said. That is the problem. My father looked at the copies on the table. So she knew I could not sign for him? Daniel nodded. The record suggests she knew Ethan was the owner. I leaned back and looked at the clock. The HOA meeting was less than 12 hours away. We had one night to understand exactly what Victoria had been building. Daniel searched the board correspondence again. At 10:41 that evening, he found an email from Victoria to another board member. The subject line was simple: owner compliance before meeting. The message contained only 2 sentences. The first said the issue needed to be resolved before the meeting. The second said the owner was currently out of state. I read it twice. Victoria had not simply chosen the wrong person. She had known I was gone and still decided to approach my father. Then Daniel opened the attachment. It was a list of properties scheduled for enforcement review at the morning meeting. My address was near the top. Beside it was a note that made my attention stop completely. Owner unavailable. Obtain acknowledgment from household representative. I looked at my father. Then I looked at Daniel. The question was no longer whether Victoria had made a mistake. The question was how far she had planned to take this before I came home. By midnight, I knew Victoria had not been improvising. She had been following a plan. Daniel printed the enforcement list and placed it beside the email we had just found. My property was not the only address marked for review. There were 12 others, all connected to homeowners who were either out of town, elderly, or temporarily unavailable. My father had simply been the easiest person for Victoria to approach that afternoon. I looked at the list again. What happens at the meeting if she gets these acknowledgments? I asked. Daniel answered carefully. She could present them as evidence that representatives of the properties accepted the new enforcement process. My father frowned. Even if they did not understand what they were signing. That is exactly why the wording matters, Daniel said. I felt my frustration rising, but I kept my voice calm. This was no longer about one HOA notice. It was about a process that could affect several homeowners who might never realize what had happened. Daniel suggested we contact the other property owners before the meeting. We started making calls. The first homeowner was traveling for work and had received a notice through email. The second had signed an acknowledgment without realizing the language was different from the original HOA policy. The third told us something that stopped me cold. Victoria told me the new form was required by the board. Daniel asked whether she had been shown the board policy. She said no. That gave us another piece of the puzzle. The board had approved one policy, but Victoria appeared to be using a different document. I asked Daniel to compare every version. He spent the next hour checking dates, file names, and meeting minutes. At 1:18 in the morning, he found another discrepancy. The document used by Victoria had been modified after the board approved the policy. Several paragraphs had been added. One of them expanded the definition of who could acknowledge an enforcement notice. Another stated that acknowledgment could be treated as confirmation that the signer accepted the association's authority over the property. My father looked at the page and shook his head. That is not what she told me. I knew that already. What I did not know was who had approved the added language. Daniel checked the file history again. The modified version had been uploaded from an account associated with the HOA office. Only 2 people had access to that account. One was the association manager. The other was Victoria. We had no proof yet that Victoria personally changed the document, and I was not going to make that accusation without evidence. But we now had enough information to ask a very serious question at the meeting. Daniel told me there was one more thing. The enforcement list included a deadline. All 12 properties were scheduled for review at 9 in the morning. That gave us less than 8 hours. I looked at my father, who had been awake for most of the night because of a situation he never should have been placed in. Dad, go home and get some rest. He hesitated. Are you sure? I nodded. Yes. I will handle the meeting. He stood, but before leaving, he looked at the papers on the table. Ethan, do not let them make this about your job. I understood exactly what he meant. My federal position could become a distraction. I did not want anyone thinking I was using government authority to settle a private neighborhood dispute. I wanted the opposite. I wanted the HOA to follow its own rules. At 6:30 in the morning, Daniel closed the final folder. We have enough to challenge the process, he said. But we still do not know why Victoria was so determined to get your father's signature. I looked at the enforcement list again. 12 properties. 12 owners. One unusual acknowledgement form. Then I noticed something I had missed earlier. Every property on the list had one thing in common. They were all scheduled for enforcement before their owners could attend the morning meeting. I looked at Daniel. She was not trying to get signatures. He waited. She was trying to get them before anyone could ask questions. Daniel nodded slowly. Outside, the first light of morning was appearing over the neighborhood. The meeting would begin in less than 3 hours. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I needed to find out. At 7:05 in the morning, Daniel and I were already inside the community clubhouse, but Victoria had not arrived yet. The meeting was scheduled for 9, and residents were beginning to gather in the hallway. I carried the 12 enforcement files in a plain folder. I did not bring the FBI convoy inside. I did not bring anyone from my federal team into the meeting. My father had been right. I wanted this handled as a private property and HOA matter, based on records and procedure. Daniel placed copies of the original HOA policy, the modified acknowledgment form, the meeting minutes, and the enforcement list on the table. Then something unexpected happened. One of the homeowners on the enforcement list walked in carrying the exact acknowledgment form we had found the night before. She looked at me and said, "They gave this to me yesterday." I asked whether she had signed it. She shook her head. "I was going to, but something felt wrong." Daniel immediately asked if he could compare her copy with ours. They were identical. That meant Victoria had distributed the modified document to multiple homeowners before the board had formally reviewed it. Another homeowner arrived and confirmed the same thing. Then a third. Within 20 minutes, 3 people had independently confirmed that they had been given the same form. The room began filling with questions. I stayed quiet until everyone had arrived. At 8:30, Victoria entered carrying her binder. She looked surprised to see so many residents holding copies of the document. "What is going on?" she asked. Daniel answered calmly. "We are comparing the acknowledgement form with the policy approved by the board." Victoria said the form was part of the enforcement process. A resident immediately asked, "Then why does the form contain language that is not in the policy?" Victoria said the language was necessary for clarification. Daniel opened the original meeting minutes. "The board did not approve this language." Victoria looked toward the association manager. The manager appeared uncomfortable and said she had assumed Victoria had received approval. That was the first moment Victoria seemed to realize the room was no longer following her lead. I asked one question. "Was this document formally approved before it was distributed?" Victoria said yes. Daniel asked, "Can you show us where?" She opened her binder and searched through the meeting minutes. Nothing matched. She checked another folder. Still nothing. Finally, she said the board had approved the policy in principle. Daniel replied, "In principle is not the same as approving this document." The room became silent. Then one homeowner stood and placed her copy on the table. "I was told this was mandatory." Another resident nodded. "So was I." Victoria insisted that everyone was misunderstanding the purpose. I did not interrupt her. I wanted her explanation recorded clearly. Daniel took notes while she spoke. She said the HOA had been dealing with homeowners who were difficult to reach, and the new process was intended to keep enforcement moving. That explanation answered one question but opened another. Why were the properties being processed before their owners had a chance to respond? Daniel pointed to the enforcement schedule. Every listed property had been placed on the agenda before the owner could appear. Victoria said that was simply efficient administration. I looked at the 12 files. "Then why did you need my father's signature before I returned?" She paused. The room waited. She finally said, "Because someone needed to acknowledge the notice." I asked, "Someone with legal authority?" She did not answer. Daniel closed the folder. "That is the question the board needs to answer before it votes on anything." Then the association manager quietly approached us and handed Daniel another document. "I found this in the archived files," she said. Daniel read the first line and immediately looked at me. It was the original policy proposal from before Victoria's version existed. At the bottom was a handwritten note from a board member. The note said the proposed acknowledgement process had been rejected months earlier. I looked at Victoria. She was staring at the document. The meeting had not even officially begun, and we had already found evidence that the process she was defending had been rejected before it was ever presented to my father. The rejected proposal changed the entire meeting. Victoria stood silently while the association manager kept the archived document open on the table. I looked at the handwritten note again. The proposed acknowledgment process had not simply been modified later. It had been rejected months earlier. Yet, a nearly identical process had been distributed to homeowners the day before. Daniel asked the association manager who had access to the archived files. She listed the board members and the management office. Then she added something unexpected. Victoria requested a copy of this proposal last week. Victoria immediately said she had requested it for reference. Daniel asked why a rejected proposal had been used to create a new acknowledgment form. Victoria said she believed the board had reconsidered the idea. One board member shook his head. I never voted on that. Another agreed. The room became noticeably quieter. I did not need to say anything. The documents were doing the work. Daniel placed the rejected proposal beside the modified form. The similarities were obvious, but the new form contained additional language that gave the acknowledgement much greater significance. A homeowner asked whether signing it could affect their property rights. Daniel answered carefully. That depends on the governing documents and the exact authority granted by the association. That is precisely why this needs to be reviewed before anyone signs anything. Victoria objected that the meeting was becoming unnecessarily complicated. She said the HOA was simply trying to keep homeowners accountable. I looked at her. Then why was the original process rejected? She did not answer. Instead, she turned to the board and argued that delays were allowing violations to remain unresolved. Her concerns sounded reasonable on the surface. But Daniel opened the enforcement list again. The 12 properties had not been selected randomly. Every one belonged to an owner who had been difficult for the HOA to reach recently. Several owners were traveling. One was caring for a family member outside the state. Another had been hospitalized for a routine procedure and was temporarily unavailable. None of that meant they had surrendered their rights. Daniel pointed to the list. The issue is not enforcement. The issue is whether the association created a shortcut around the people who were supposed to receive these notices. That sentence changed the discussion. A board member asked Victoria whether she had contacted the owners directly before approaching their relatives, tenants, or representatives. Victoria said she had attempted to reach them. Daniel asked for the records showing those attempts. She opened her binder. Some notices were there. Others were not. Then the association manager spoke again. There is something else. She pulled a second archived file from a cabinet behind the desk. This was attached to the original enforcement schedule. Daniel opened it. The document showed that several properties had been marked for accelerated review before the new acknowledgment policy was even proposed. I felt a chill of realization. The acknowledgment form had not created the enforcement plan. It had been created to support a plan that already existed. Daniel looked at me. This is bigger than your father's situation. I nodded. My father had been the immediate target, but the record suggested a broader pattern involving multiple homeowners. Victoria tried to close the discussion by saying the board could review everything later. Daniel shook his head. Not if you are asking people to vote on enforcement this morning. The board chair agreed. The vote was paused. But before anyone could relax, the association manager found one final page attached to the accelerated review list. It contained a column labeled Owner Status. Beside my property, the status was marked Unavailable. Beside another property it said Out of state. Beside a third, Family Representative Present. Daniel stared at the column for several seconds. Then he looked at me and said, They were tracking who was absent before deciding which properties to accelerate. I looked across the table at Victoria. The question was no longer whether the HOA had made a mistake. Someone had been choosing moments when homeowners were least able to respond. And now we had to find out who had made those choices. The room went silent after Daniel read the owner status column. For the first time that morning, Victoria did not immediately defend the process. She looked toward the association manager, then toward the board chair. I stayed seated beside my father, because I wanted the board to ask the questions itself. Daniel requested the complete communication log for every property on the accelerated review list. The association manager opened a system and began pulling records. The first property had 3 unanswered emails. The second had 1 mailed notice. The third had no documented contact attempt at all. Then we reached my property. There was an email addressed to me, but it had been sent after the enforcement review had already been scheduled. Daniel checked the timestamp. The meeting notice came first. The owner notice came later. I looked at Victoria. So the property was placed on the review list before I was notified. She said the schedule had been prepared in advance. Daniel nodded. Then the owner notification was not what triggered the review. Victoria said the process allowed preliminary scheduling. Daniel asked where that authority appeared in the governing documents. She could not immediately identify it. The board chair asked her to show the section. She searched through her binder, but the room remained quiet while she looked. Finally, the association manager found the relevant provision. It allowed the board to place a property on an agenda, but it did not authorize the association to obtain an acknowledgment from someone who was not the legal owner. That distinction mattered. My father looked at me. I could see the relief on his face. He had spent the previous day wondering whether he had somehow caused the problem by refusing to cooperate. I told him quietly, "You did exactly what you should have done." Daniel then asked for the communication records connected to the other 11 properties. Several homeowners stepped forward and confirmed that they had received notices only after their properties were already placed on the review schedule. One homeowner said Victoria had told her the new acknowledgment form was mandatory. Another said she had been told that failing to sign would automatically move her property into enforcement. Daniel documented each statement. The board chair finally asked Victoria a direct question. "Did you personally instruct staff to use this form?" Victoria said the form was part of the new process. The chair repeated the question. "Did you instruct staff to use it?" Victoria paused before answering yes. That admission changed the room. It did not prove every allegation against her, but it established that she had personally directed the use of the disputed form. Daniel then opened the archived proposal that had been rejected months earlier. He placed it beside the modified form and pointed out the matching language. The board chair looked from one document to the other. Why was a rejected proposal used as the basis for this form? Victoria said she believed the board had intended to revisit it. The chair shook his head. Believing something was going to be approved is not the same as receiving approval. The meeting was now focused entirely on the process Victoria had created. But Daniel was not finished. He opened the original email that listed the properties by owner availability. My property was marked owner unavailable. The board chair asked who had created that list. The association manager checked the file history. The document had been created from Victoria's account. Victoria said she had only compiled information for administrative purposes. Daniel asked why owner availability was relevant to enforcement scheduling. She had no immediate answer. Then the association manager opened another attachment. It was an internal message sent the evening before Victoria approached my father. The message contained a single instruction: resolve the outstanding acknowledgments before the owner's return. My father looked at me. Daniel looked at the board. I looked at Victoria. The question had finally become impossible to avoid. She had not simply been enforcing rules. She had been timing the process around the absence of the people who could challenge it. And now the board had to decide what to do before the meeting ended. The board chair looked around the room and finally said, "We are not voting on enforcement today." Victoria immediately objected. She argued that delaying the process would make the association look weak, but the chair remained firm. This is no longer a routine enforcement matter. We have documents that need to be reviewed. My father exhaled quietly beside me. I could see the tension leaving his shoulders for the first time since I had arrived. Daniel gathered the copies of the disputed acknowledgment, the original policy, the rejected proposal, the enforcement list, and the communication records. He placed them in order on the table. The evidence does not establish that every action was intentional, he said, but it does establish that the association used a form that was not approved, approached people who were not the legal owners, and scheduled properties for review before those owners had a reasonable opportunity to respond. Nobody argued with that summary. Victoria looked toward the board chair. I was trying to keep the neighborhood compliant, the chair answered. That may have been your intention. It does not explain why the approved process was changed. That distinction mattered. I did not want Victoria punished simply because she had made herself my enemy. I wanted the record corrected. I wanted my father to know he had not done anything wrong. And I wanted every homeowner on that list to have the same opportunity to respond that I would have expected for myself. The board voted to suspend the disputed enforcement actions and send the documents to an independent reviewer. The modified acknowledgment form was removed from use. The 12 properties were taken off the accelerated schedule until the review was complete. The association manager agreed to correct the communication records and notify every affected homeowner. Then the board chair turned to Victoria. Until the review is finished, you will not issue additional acknowledgments under this process. Victoria looked stunned. She had entered the room believing she was there to defend a routine procedure. Instead, she was now being asked to step back from the very process she had created. I looked at my father. He gave me a small smile. That was the only victory I needed. After the meeting, we walked outside together. The morning air was cool, and the neighborhood was quiet again. My father looked at me and said, I still cannot believe all of this started because I would not sign a piece of paper. I smiled. That piece of paper was the reason we found everything else. He nodded. Then he asked the question I had been avoiding. What about the FBI convoy? I told him the truth. The convoy had never been there to intimidate anyone. I had been returning from official federal duties, and the escort was part of the security arrangements for my trip home. I had never used my position to settle the HOA dispute. I never needed to. The records had been enough. A week later, Daniel called with the independent review results. The disputed process had not been properly approved, the acknowledgment forms had been used outside the documented procedure, and the enforcement schedule required significant corrections. Victoria was required to cooperate with the review and step away from the process while the board considered further action. My father never had to sign another document for the HOA. As we stood outside my house that evening, he looked toward the clubhouse and said, You know what the strange part is? I asked what he meant. He smiled. They thought they needed your father to sign something because you were gone. They never realized that the moment they tried to work around you, they created the evidence that proved what they were doing. I looked at the quiet street and nodded. The convoy had attracted everyone's attention, but it was never the thing that settled the dispute. The truth was much simpler. When someone believes authority gives them the right to ignore the rules, the strongest answer is often the one they cannot argue with: the records, the facts, and the rules they were supposed to follow themselves.